Tonight, let us step back into a quieter century, when the streets were lit by gas lamps, letters arrived by hand, and the night felt wider than the world itself. In those days, a creaking stair, a distant whistle, or a knock at the wrong hour could turn ordinary life into something unexplainable. So settle in, loosen your shoulders, and let the rain, the darkness, and these old-fashioned tales carry you gently towards sleep. 7 stories await, each one drawn from the kind of fear that lingers softly like perfume in a closed room. I have kept a little book in the drawer beside my bed since the spring of 1908, not because I imagine my days are remarkable, but because a man who spends his nights on the streets begins to mistrust his own memory. After midnight, the city rearranges itself. Familiar corners become strange, and a lamppost you have passed 100 times can seem, for a moment, like a marker left for you alone. It was in that frame of mind on May 17th, with rain falling in a steady sheet and gas lamps wearing pale halos, that I took what should have been my last fare. I drove a hired motor cab then, one of the newer ones, black as wet ink and temperamental if you treated the engine roughly. I had meant to go home early. My hands were stiff, my collar chafed, and the comfort of my room felt near enough to taste. I was turning toward the yard when I saw him beneath the awning of a shuttered tobacconist. The street was narrow, brick on both sides, the kind that holds the sound of rain like a bowl. He did not wave. He simply stood in the downpour as though the weather had no authority over him. I ought to have driven on, but I eased to the curb and lowered the window a fraction. "You looking for a hire?" "Yes," he said. His voice was soft, careful, the sort you hear in certain clubs. His coat was dark and well cut, his hat brim shedding the rain in neat drops. "If you are still working." "Where to?" He gave an address, and I repeated it back to be sure. He nodded and took the rear seat, choosing to sit behind me rather than beside, though the front would have been drier. In the mirror, I saw only the lower half of his face, still as a portrait. We set off. The wipers scraped across the glass. The rain made a patient whisper on the roof. We passed a late cafe where a few men smoked under the awning, their laughter thin and tired, and then a row of dark shop fronts that looked like closed eyes. I asked a question out of habit, because silence in a small space can become heavy. "Busy tonight?" I said. "Busy enough," he replied, then added, as if continuing a thought, "You have been driving long, Mr. Hale?" My hands tightened. "Have I told you my name?" "No," he said gently, "but I know it. My name was on a small plaque on the dash, required by the company." I told myself that explained it. Still, the way he said it, not like a discovery, but like a remembrance, unsettled me. He watched the blurred streetlights slide past. "Rain washes the streets clean," he said. "It makes everything look new again, or old." His destination lay toward Gaslamp Street, a district that kept its ornate lamps for appearance. I knew the area well, and yet, as we approached, I felt the uneasy sensation of arriving somewhere I had not chosen. The air changed first. Even through the wet, there was a faint smell like cold ash, as if a hearth had been emptied nearby. The buildings grew taller and closer, their upper stories disappearing into mist. The lamps along the way seemed spaced farther apart than I remembered, and the darkness between them felt longer than it should. At a crossing, I expected to see a constable. There was none. At another corner, A street musician I often heard was absent, leaving only the rain and the ticking of my engine. Small things, perhaps. The sort of small things that mean nothing in daylight. But in the middle of the night, they feel like omissions in a story you thought you knew. The numbers on the buildings began to trouble me. A brass 12 sat where my memory insisted there should have been a 10. A doorway I remembered as a bakery was bricked over, its mortar too fresh. A painted sign above a window spelled a name I could not read properly, though it was plain enough. It was as if the street had been rebuilt from an imperfect description, someone guessing at details they had only heard. The address was number 33. Number 33 should not have existed. A fire, years ago, had taken half that block. I remembered the orange light turning windows into squares of flame, remembered the crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder, remembered police pushing people back with firm hands. I remembered deciding it was safer to drive away and let the authorities manage it. The lot had remained fenced and black ever since, a scar the neighborhood learned to step around. But as the cab rolled forward, I saw number 31, then 33. There, in the rain, stood a narrow house with an iron gate and 2 lamps burning steadily beside its door. Curtains were drawn upstairs. A wreath hung on the door as if it were December. I stopped at the curb and stared until my eyes stung. The house looked perfectly ordinary, and that was the worst part. It did not look like a haunted place. It looked like a place that had always been there, waiting for its number to be spoken aloud. "You can let me out here," the man said. "Sir," I began, and my voice failed me. There was too much to say, and none of it sensible. In the mirror I caught his eyes, pale and calm. "You are tired, Mr. Hale," he said. "Night mixes its years." "There was a fire," I managed. "Yes," he replied, as if confirming an appointment. "There was." He stepped out. Cold air and rain entered the cab. He stood beside the door and looked back at me. "You drove that night too," he said quietly. Memory came sharp and unwanted. Smoke rolling from a broken window. A young woman in a light dress running into rain. A man shouting. And me hesitating in my cab until the fear of being trapped in the crush persuaded me to turn away. I had told myself for years that leaving was sensible, that I could not have helped, that I had done nothing wrong by protecting myself. "I remember a fire," I whispered. "And the house remembers you," he said. He reached into his coat and produced payment. He did not hand it through the window. He placed it on the seat beside me, carefully, like something delicate. It was a coin, heavy and dull, with a profile I did not recognize, and edges worn smooth. "You've paid too much," I said, "because habit is stubborn." "Not at all," he answered. "Debts are rarely paid in the currency we expect." Then he shut the door and walked to the iron gate. The gate opened without a sound. He went up the steps and took out a key. Just before turning it, he looked back once more. "Safe driving," he said softly. "That is what they say about you." The door shut behind him. The lamps remained lit. I sat there far too long, engine idling, breath fogging the glass. At last I forced my hands to move and drove away, glancing into the mirror as if I might see him seated behind me again. At the corner I stopped beneath a lamp and looked back. The house at number 33 was gone. There was only the fenced black lot, slick with rain, and a sign warning of unstable ground. Gaslamp Street looked ordinary again, and in that ordinariness was a coldness that raised the hair on my arms. I drove the longer way to the yard, avoiding that block as if distance itself could keep a thing from remembering me. The clerk in the little office barely glanced up when I returned the cab. He was half asleep over the ledger, ink stain on his thumb. "Late one?" he murmured. "Late," I said. He slid the book toward me. "Sign here." I wrote my name, and as the pen scratched, I saw the last entry already there, written in the same hand as the others. Passenger, Hale, G, pickup, tobacconist, Harlow Lane, drop, gas lamp Saint, number 33, fare, paid. I stared until the letters blurred. "You wrote this?" I asked. The clerk frowned, confused. "You did," he said, and turned the page as if it were nothing at all. In my room later, I opened my little book and wrote until my hand steadied. When I finished, I took the coin from my pocket and set it on the page. It left a dark circle on the paper, as if it had come from somewhere deeper than the rain. It smelled, faintly of smoke, though no smoke clung to my clothes. Under the lamplight, the date became clear. 1871. I have never seen a coin like it since, but when rain falls steady and patient and gas lamps wear their halos, I find myself thinking of number 33 and of the way he said my name, as if it belonged to the house as much as it belonged to me. And on those nights, when I finally doze, I sometimes dream of iron gates opening without a sound, and of a door that waits, politely, to be unlocked. I took a room at the Brackenridge boarding house in the autumn of 1912, during a period of my life when I required inexpensive lodging and asked few questions. The house stood on a narrow street not far from the river, a tall brick structure with narrow windows and a permanent smell of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. It was not an unkind place, merely tired, like the people who lived there. Mrs. Brackenridge herself occupied the ground floor and enforced her rules with polite firmness. No visitors after 9, no cooking in the rooms, no noise after 10. Her voice had the brittle quality of someone who had spent many years listening for trouble. The tenants, myself included, learned quickly to keep our lives compact. My room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a narrow corridor with wallpaper patterned in faded vines. The paper had begun to peel in places, curling like dry leaves. At night, the gas lights hummed faintly, and the floorboards spoke in small complaints whenever someone passed. For the first week, I slept well enough. I worked long hours at the docks, and exhaustion is a reliable sedative. It was not until the 2nd week that I began to notice the sound. It was subtle at first, a soft, brushing noise like fingertips passing lightly over paper. It came from the wall beside my bed, the one shared with the next room. I assumed it was my neighbor turning in his sleep, or perhaps the settling of the building. Old houses have their own language, and this was hardly my first experience with one. But the sound did not follow the usual rhythms. It did not stop when I turned over. It did not respond to movement or silence. It came every night, always after midnight, always in the same slow pattern. Brush, pause, brush again. I mentioned it one evening to the man who lodged across the hall, a bookkeeper with ink-stained cuffs. "Thin walls," he said, without looking up from his paper. "You'll get used to it." I tried. The difficulty was not the noise itself, but the way it seemed deliberate. There was intention in it. Not frantic scratching like rats, nor random creaking like pipes. It sounded almost careful, as though someone were touching the wall to reassure themselves that it was still there. One night, curiosity overcame fatigue. I pressed my ear against the wallpaper. The sound ceased immediately. I waited. The wall felt cool and dry beneath my cheek. After a long moment, just as I began to feel foolish, the sound resumed. Slower now. Closer. I pulled back sharply, my heart behaving like an embarrassed child caught misbehaving. The next morning I noticed something new. The wallpaper beside my bed had lifted further overnight. A thin seam ran vertically, no wider than a matchstick, as though the paper had been cut and gently pulled apart. I reported this to Mrs. Brackenridge. She inspected the wall with narrowed eyes and pursed lips. "These houses shift," she said. "Nothing to trouble yourself over." "Has anyone stayed in the room next to mine recently?" I asked. She hesitated, only briefly. "No one at present," she said. "It's been empty for some time." That answer did not sit well with me, but I lacked the nerve to challenge her. That night, the sound returned earlier than usual. Brush. Pause. Brush. This time, it was unmistakably closer. Not muffled by plaster, but directly behind the paper. I lay rigid beneath my blanket, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing. The sound continued for nearly an hour before stopping all at once, leaving the room unbearably quiet. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and dreamless. The following evening, I examined the wall more closely. The seam had widened. A thin strip of wallpaper hung loose, revealing darkened plaster beneath. There were faint marks there, lines and smudges that did not resemble cracks. They resembled finger marks. I wish I could say I acted sensibly then, that I fetched the landlady or removed myself at once. Instead, I did what many people do when confronted with something that defies reason. I tried to understand it. Using the dull edge of a pocket knife, I lifted the loose paper. It came away easily, releasing a faint, stale odor. Behind it was not solid plaster, but a shallow recess, no deeper than a man's forearm. The space was narrow, uneven, and clearly not part of the original construction. Something had been carved out. Inside the recess lay a folded scrap of cloth, gray with age. I touched it and felt a peculiar warmth, as though it had been held only moments before. Beneath it was something harder, a button. It was old-fashioned, bone or ivory, the kind used on men's coats years ago. More buttons lay behind it, several of them, and something else, small, careful scratches etched into the plaster, running in rows. Marks made by someone counting. I covered the recess again, my hands trembling despite my efforts. That night, I did not undress. I sat on the edge of my bed with my coat still on, lamp burning low, listening. The sound began promptly at midnight, but it no longer brushed. Now it tapped. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. I rose and crossed the room without thinking. When I touched the wallpaper, it felt warmer than the rest of the wall. I pulled the paper aside. The recess was deeper, much deeper. Darkness receded inward, swallowing the lamplight. From within came a slow, measured breathing. Not labored, not distressed, simply patient. A voice followed, so quiet I felt it more than heard it. "Please," it said, "don't tell her." I stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. The breathing stopped at once. I fled the room without my coat, without my boots, running down the corridor barefoot on cold wood. Mrs. Brackenridge was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, fully dressed, lamp in hand. "You found it," she said. Her voice held no surprise. She led me into the neighboring room. It was smaller than mine, stripped almost bare. The far wall showed where boards had been removed and replaced. Fresh nails glinted in the light. "He came to me last winter," she said. "Said he needed a place to rest, said he'd be quiet." I did not ask him who he was. He paid, she continued. Not much, but enough. What is he? I whispered. She looked at me then, and her eyes were not cruel, only resigned. Someone who ran out of room, she said. I left that night. I did not return for my belongings. Years later, when I passed that street, the house is gone, replaced by a narrow warehouse. Yet sometimes, when I wake too early and lie listening, I swear I can still hear it. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. As if someone somewhere is still counting the walls that keep them hidden. I was employed as the night clerk at the North Hollow telegraph office during the winter of 1903, a position that required patience more than skill. The town itself was little more than a pause between larger places, a collection of narrow streets, a rail siding, and a river that moved slowly enough to appear thoughtful. After sunset, North Hollow belonged almost entirely to the wind and the occasional late train. The telegraph office stood beside the tracks, a narrow wooden building with a coal stove, a long counter, and the constant faint smell of hot metal. By day, it bustled modestly. By night, it became something closer to a listening post, tuned to distant places and unseen hands. My shift began at 10 and ended at 6. Between those hours, messages were rare. Most nights passed in silence, broken only by the ticking of the regulator clock and the soft creak of the building settling into the cold. I was paid to remain awake, to listen, and to respond if the wire spoke. For several weeks, nothing unusual occurred. Then, one night in late January, the key clicked on its own. At first, I assumed it was interference, static carried through the line by weather, or a poorly grounded connection. Such things happened often enough, but this was not random. The signal was clean, deliberate. I leaned forward, pencil poised. The message came slowly, each letter spaced with care. Are you alone? I frowned and checked the log. No incoming traffic was scheduled at that hour. I tapped a brief response. Identify your station. There was a pause long enough for me to become aware of the wind pressing against the walls. Then the key moved again. North Hollow. My hand stilled. That's not possible, I muttered, though no one was there to hear it. The wire could not send a message to itself. It required 2 stations, 2 operators. I replied, anyway. This is North Hollow who is sending. The answer came almost immediately. A chill crept up my arms, the kind that does not belong to the cold. I stood and checked the line connections, half expecting to find a prankster's device or a crossed wire. Everything was as it should have been. When I returned to the desk, the key was silent. I told myself it was nothing. Fatigue plays tricks. Night magnifies small confusions into imagined patterns. I wrote a brief note in the log and resolved to forget the matter. But the following night, at precisely 1:17 a.m., the key began again. This time, I did not speak first. Do not turn around. The message appeared without preamble, its letters steady and unhurried. My chair creaked softly as my weight shifted despite my resolve. I felt suddenly conscious of the space behind me, of the narrow room and the single door, of the shadows the stove cast along the far wall. I forced myself to reply. This is not amusing. The response was patient. I know the clock ticked. Coal shifted in the stove with a muted clatter. Who are you? I tapped. There was a longer pause this time, long enough for doubt to creep in. Perhaps a line fault, perhaps my own nervousness filling in gaps. Then, you in a few hours. I stood abruptly, knocking my chair back. The room was empty. The windows reflected only my own pale face and the yellow glow of the lamps. I did not sleep that day. On the third night, the message came earlier. You will receive a telegram at 2:42. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:58. From whom I asked. The reply was slower now, as if the sender were choosing each letter with care. From the river at 2:41, I stood alone in the office, staring at the door. At 2:42, someone knocked. I opened it to find the station boy, cap pulled low, breath fogging in the cold. Telegram, he said, avoiding my eyes. The envelope was damp. Inside was a single line, written in a hand I recognized instantly as my own. The ice will not hold. I dropped the paper as if it burned. The boy was already gone. The key clicked once more. You see my fingers hovered over the brass. This is impossible. That does not matter. The messages continued each night thereafter. Always precise, always accurate. A freight derailment 2 miles south. A man found dead in his bed. A fire at the mill before the first bell rang. Each event arrived first on the wire, then in the world, and always, beneath the facts, was something else, an awareness, a presence that knew not only events, but decisions. One night, the message was different. You have been thinking about the river. I swallowed. The river ran behind the station, broad and dark, its surface frozen unevenly. I had crossed it many times in daylight without fear, but at night it looked deeper than it should have been. Yes, I admitted. You should not wait, I did not reply. It will be easier before dawn. At 4:03 a.m., the final message arrived. I am cold. I stood, shaking, and turned slowly. The room was empty, yet the cold had deepened, pressing inward as though the walls themselves were drawing breath. Frost traced the inside of the window panes in delicate patterns that resembled branching veins. The key clicked once more. Come now. I do not remember leaving the station. They found my coat folded neatly on the riverbank at sunrise. The ice, broken inward, had already begun to smooth itself over. The telegraph office remained intact, the logbook open to the final entry written in my hand. No outgoing messages were recorded after that hour. The line, they said, had been dead all night. Years later, the station was closed, the wires cut, the building left to rot. But men who pass that stretch of river after dark claim that sometimes, when the wind is right, they hear a faint clicking sound carried across the ice. Slow, deliberate, waiting for someone else to answer. I boarded the Margaret Elaine in the summer of 1915, intending only to travel upriver for 2 nights and be done with it. Riverboats were not romantic to those who worked around them. They were damp, smelled of oil and river water, and carried a peculiar restlessness, as if the current itself refused to let anything remain still for long. The Elaine was a modest vessel, paddle-wheel driven, its paint already peeling despite its relative youth. Lanterns lined the deck, casting a soft amber glow that made the river look thicker than it was. The passengers were few, a traveling salesman, a widow dressed in permanent black, a pair of men who spoke little and watched everything. My cabin was on the lower deck, narrow but clean. Directly across the corridor was cabin 7. Its door was locked when I arrived, a brass tag hanging neatly from the handle. Unoccupied, it read. I remember it clearly because I checked twice. Riverboats have a way of misplacing people. The first night passed, without incident until sometime after midnight, when the engine slowed and the river seemed to hold its breath. I lay awake listening to the soft slap of water against the hull, the gentle creak of wood adjusting to movement. That was when I heard the coughing. It came from across the corridor, not loud, not urgent. A restrained, wet sound, as if the person producing it were trying very hard not to disturb anyone else. It lasted several seconds, paused, then returned. I sat up, every sense alert. Perhaps someone had been assigned the cabin late. Perhaps the tag had not been changed. River crews were not known for paperwork. I told myself this as the coughing faded into a long, uneven exhale. Sleep did not come easily after that. The next morning I mentioned it casually to a steward while taking coffee on deck. "Cabin 7?" he said, frowning. "No, sir. That room's been locked all season." "Someone was inside last night," I said. He shook his head with polite certainty. "Impossible. Captain's orders." I did not press him. There are certain expressions that close conversations, and his was one of them. That evening, as dusk settled over the river, I found myself watching the corridor more than the water. The door to cabin 7 remained closed. The brass tag still read unoccupied. At precisely 1 o'clock, the coughing began again. This time, it was closer to the door, followed by something else. Footsteps, slow, careful. Pacing the narrow space inside the cabin, back and forth, as though the person were measuring it repeatedly. Then a sound like damp fabric brushing wood. I stood and crossed the corridor before I could reconsider. The door was cold beneath my knuckles. "Are you unwell?" I called quietly. The pacing stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the low churn of the paddle wheel and the distant cry of something moving along the riverbank. Then, from the other side of the door, came a voice. "Please," it said. "Do not open it." The voice was hoarse, strained, yet unmistakably human. "Why not?" I asked, my heart beating far too loudly. "Because," it replied after a pause, "it is not my door." Before I could respond, the footsteps retreated. The coughing returned, deeper now, as if drawn from the chest with effort. I fetched the steward despite his reluctance. Together, we stood before the door, lantern held high. He unlocked it. The cabin was empty. The bed was neatly made. The wash basin dry. No luggage, no clothing, no sign of occupation at all. But the floor was wet, not spilled water, tracked water. Bare footprints, dark against the wood, leading from the bed to the door and back again. They were small, uneven, as though the walker favored one foot. The steward backed away without a word. The captain was summoned. He inspected the cabin silently, his face unreadable. At last, he reached down and touched the floor. "River," he said simply. The door was locked again. We did not speak of it afterward. The coughing did not return on the final night. Instead, some time before dawn, I woke to the sound of dripping water. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, a soft, patient rhythm that matched my own pulse. When I stepped into the corridor, I saw the door of cabin 7 standing open. The tag lay on the floor. It now read, "Occupied." No one else was awake. The river moved silently past the windows, dark and unbroken. I closed the door myself and did not look inside. At sunrise, as we docked, the captain stood beside me at the rail. "Sometimes," he said, watching the water, "the river takes longer to let people go." I disembarked without replying. I later learned that cabin 7 had once belonged to a deckhand who slipped during a storm years earlier and vanished beneath the paddle wheel. His body was never recovered. The company sealed the room afterward, citing structural concerns. I have traveled many rivers since then, but never again at night, and never again past a locked door that sounds as though it is breathing. In 1906, I earned my living as a photographer of the recently departed, a profession that existed quietly alongside grief and was spoken of only when necessary. Families preferred not to dwell on the details. They wished only to preserve a final likeness, something dignified to place upon the mantle or tuck into a prayer book. I provided that service with professionalism and restraint. My studio occupied the ground floor of a narrow building near the cemetery, chosen for convenience rather than sentiment. The windows faced north to catch steady light, and the walls were kept plain so as not to distract the eye. I worked alone, save for the families who visited briefly, stiff with sorrow, and then left me to my task. At first, the work troubled me less than one might expect. The dead are patient subjects. They do not blink. They do not complain. And if you treat them gently, they reward you with stillness. It was only after the third year that I began to notice the irregularities. The first instance was easy to dismiss. A young woman had been brought in by her parents, arranged carefully in a chair, her hands folded around a small bouquet. I set the plate, adjusted the lens, and ignited the flash powder. When the image developed later that evening, I saw nothing amiss at first. Then I noticed the shadow. It fell behind her left shoulder, long and narrow, cast as though by someone standing just out of frame. Yet I had been alone in the room. I remember distinctly bolting the door, drawing the curtains, and working in silence. I scraped the plate and told myself the exposure had been flawed. The second time, I could not ignore it. An elderly man, brought by his sons, photographed lying peacefully upon a draped table. The developed image showed his face clearly, and beside him, faint but unmistakable, another face, partially obscured, its features blurred as if caught mid-turn. It was not reflected glass, not a chemical artifact. It had depth. I did not sleep that night. By the third occurrence, a pattern emerged. The additional presence never appeared when the subject was living. Only when the body before my lens was beyond breath did the anomaly occur. Always faint, always just beyond focus, always close. I began keeping the flawed plates rather than destroying them, storing them in a wooden box beneath my work table. At times, I told myself this was simple curiosity. At others, I knew it was something less respectable. One evening in November, as dusk fell early and the gas lamps hissed softly, I prepared a portrait for a child no older than 7. Her mother lingered in the doorway, twisting her gloves. "Please," she said, voice thin, "make her look as though she is only resting." I assured her I would. When the plate developed, my breath caught painfully in my chest. The child lay as arranged. But behind her, standing tall and close, was a figure so distinct I felt certain I must have remembered them being present. It was a man, thin, his head bowed slightly, his hands folded in imitation of the child's. His face was turned toward her, expression unreadable, and though the image was monochrome, I knew with absolute certainty that his eyes were open. I locked the studio and did not return for 2 days. When I did, I found the box beneath my table disturbed. The plates inside were no longer arranged as I had left them. They were ordered now, earliest to latest, as though someone had been studying them carefully. That night, long after the street had gone quiet, I heard movement within the studio. It was not footsteps. It was the subtle shift of weight, the sound of someone standing where they had not been before. I froze behind the curtain that separated my workroom from the small living space behind. A voice spoke, calm and precise. "You capture us more clearly each time." I stepped forward despite every instinct warning me not to. The studio was empty, but the camera stood uncovered, its lens pointed toward the chair where the child had sat days earlier. The shutter clicked softly, once, though no plate was loaded. From that night onward, the presence no longer confined itself to the photographs. I sensed it when I prepared chemicals, felt it when I adjusted lighting. Sometimes faint impressions appeared on the glass before development. Handprints, partial profiles, suggestions of forms too close to the lens. Sleep became elusive. I began to wake with the certainty that I was not alone, that someone stood just beyond my vision, waiting with infinite patience. One evening, driven by equal parts dread and resolve, I prepared a plate after locking the studio doors. I positioned the camera toward my own chair and sat, hands folded, posture correct. The flash ignited. When the image developed, I understood. I sat in the chair, eyes closed, face calm. Behind me stood dozens of figures, layered one upon another, faces emerging from shadow. Some watched me, others faced the lens, directly. And closest of all, his hand rested lightly on my shoulder. The following morning, a colleague found the studio door unlocked. Inside, the camera stood ready. The plate from the previous night had been washed and set aside carefully. It showed only an empty chair. The box of flawed plates was gone. The studio was later sold. Families still come and go from the building, unaware of its former purpose. Yet those who live above it claim that sometimes, when evening light fades and the air grows still, they hear the faint click of a shutter, followed by the soft rustle of someone stepping back, satisfied with the likeness they have taken. I returned to Grayfield in the winter of 1901, having been away for nearly a decade, and found that very little had changed. The town still lay folded between low hills, its houses gathered close as though for warmth, its streets narrow and uneven. Time moved slowly there, not because the people wished it so, but because nothing ever seemed urgent enough to hurry. The church stood at the town's highest point, a modest stone building with a square bell tower that could be seen from almost anywhere. It was not beautiful, but it was solid, and for as long as I could remember, it had been locked every night without exception. I took lodging at the only inn, a quiet place where the fire was always low and conversation rarely rose above a murmur. On my first evening, as snow began to fall in soft, deliberate flakes, I asked the innkeeper about the bell. He paused with his hand on a mug. "You've heard it already then," he said. "I've heard nothing," I replied. "You will." That night, I woke at precisely 2:17 a.m. I did not know the time until later, but I remember the moment clearly. It was not noise that woke me, but the absence of it. The wind had ceased. The fire had settled. The inn seemed to hold its breath. Then the bell rang. Once. The sound was deep and measured, not hurried. It carried easily through the cold air, settling into the bones rather than the ears. After a pause, it rang again. Then a third time. I lay still, listening. The bell stopped. The following morning, I joined the innkeeper at breakfast. "The bell," I said carefully. "Does it ring often?" He poured tea without looking at me. "Every night." "At the same hour?" "Yes." "Who rings it?" "No one. he said. "That's the trouble." The church, he explained, had been closed at night since the death of the old sexton years earlier. The doors were locked at dusk, the keys kept by the mayor and the constable. No one entered after sunset. Yet every night, without fail, the bell rang 3 times at 2:17. The constable, a thin man with a permanent stoop, confirmed this when I sought him out. "I've checked it myself," he said. "Doors bolted, windows barred, no rope movement when I get inside afterward." "What do the townspeople say?" He hesitated. "They say it's a reminder." "Of what?" He did not answer. That evening, driven by curiosity more than sense, I climbed the hill before dusk and walked the perimeter of the church. The stone walls were cold to the touch, the windows narrow and set high. Snow gathered in the corners, untouched. The door, when it was locked, closed with finality. I returned to the inn and waited. Sleep came lightly. When it broke, I knew the moment had arrived before the bell sounded. There's a particular tension that precedes certain events, a subtle tightening in the air, as though the world itself anticipates what is about to occur. The bell rang. Once. Pause. Twice. Pause. A third. Time. I rose and dressed without fully understanding why. By the time I stepped outside, the sound had faded, leaving the night unnaturally still. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I climbed the hill, my breath clouding before me. The church stood dark, its tower silhouetted against the sky. No light showed within. I circled it slowly, noting the undisturbed snow along the walls. No footprints, no sign of passage. Yet from within, I heard something else. Movement. Not footsteps, but the slow shifting of weight, as though someone were standing for a long time and adjusting their balance. I placed my hand against the door. The wood vibrated faintly. The next morning, the town gathered for Sunday service. The church opened as it always did, filled with the soft murmurs of habit. I watched closely as the bell rope was examined. It hung still, dusted with age, its fibers stiff. No one spoke of the ringing aloud. But I noticed the looks exchanged between parishioners, the way certain faces turned toward the tower when the service ended, as if counting something only they could see. Later that day, the mayor agreed to speak with me privately. "It began after the flood," he said. Years earlier, heavy rains had swelled the river beyond its banks. The lower part of town had flooded swiftly in the night. By the time the alarm was raised, several homes were already submerged. The church bell, he said, had not rung that night. "They drowned quietly," he said. "By the time we knew, it was too late." "How many?" I asked. He folded his hands. 3 families, he said. 17 souls. "And the bell?" The mayor looked at the floor. "It began ringing a week later." The townspeople had tried everything. They had posted guards. They had sealed the tower. They had even cut the rope once, though it was replaced the next morning, neatly spliced, without explanation. No one left town because of it. Grayfield was not a place people left easily. They endured. On my final night, unable to ignore the pull of it any longer, I resolved to remain inside the church after dusk. The constable objected at first, then relented, locking the doors behind me with an uneasy expression. "Do not go into the tower," he said. "Whatever you hear." I agreed. The church interior was colder than I expected. Shadows pooled in the corners as the light faded. I sat in the front pew, listening to the slow tick of my pocket watch. At 2:16, the air changed. The silence grew heavy, pressing inward. I became acutely aware of the space above me, of the bell hanging in darkness, of the rope descending through the ceiling. At 2:17, the rope moved. It did not swing. It did not jerk. It tightened. The bell rang. Once, I stood, my legs unsteady. The bell rang again. This time, I heard voices. Not loud, not pleading, simply present. A layered murmur, like many people speaking softly at once. On the third ring, I saw them. They stood between the pews, filling the aisles without sound. Men, women, children, their forms pale and indistinct, as though seen through water. Their clothes clung to them. Their hair hung heavy. They did not look at me. They looked upward. The bell rang a final time, and the figures turned as one toward the tower. Then they were gone. The rope slackened. The church fell silent. At dawn, the constable unlocked the doors to find me sitting where he had left me. "You heard it," he said. "Yes," I replied. He nodded once. That morning, for the first time since the flood, the bell did not ring. The river had frozen solid overnight. I left Grayfield that day and did not return. Yet sometimes, when winter settles deeply and the world grows quiet at precisely the wrong hour, I wake with the sensation of listening for something long overdue. And somewhere, far away, I imagine a bell that waits, not to warn, but to remember. In the autumn of 1909, I rented a small house on the edge of Marrowfield, a town that smelled of damp leaves and coal smoke and had the habit of turning quiet before the sun had fully set. I took the place because it was inexpensive, because it was near my work, and because the owner assured me, too quickly, I later thought, that it had been kept in good order. The house was narrow and plain, with a little iron fence and a front step worn smooth by many feet. Indoors, the rooms were clean, but oddly bare of personality, as if the walls preferred not to hold on to anyone for long. The previous tenant, I was told, had moved back east, which is the sort of phrase people use when they mean to end a conversation without lying outright. For the first week, I lived there comfortably enough. I rose early, returned late, and made myself small suppers in the kitchen while the wind pressed at the windows. I learned the ordinary noises of the place. The soft pop of the stove as it cooled, the sigh of pipes, the occasional complaint of a floorboard. Old houses make their own music. Then, one evening, I heard something that did not belong. It came from above. Faint crackle, then a thin, wavering tune, like a song remembered incorrectly. I set down my bowl and listened, head tilted. It was unmistakable, a phonograph. I climbed the stairs. The house had no proper third floor, only an attic reached by a ladder and a trap door at the end of the hall. I stood beneath it, waiting, and the music stopped as if it had been caught. I told myself it was the wind, or fatigue, or some harmless coincidence. But the next night, just after 9, the same sound returned, clearer now. A slow waltz, trembling with that peculiar old machine quality, as though the melody were coming through cloth. I took a lantern and went up. The attic smelled of dust and cold wood. Boxes sat in the corners, their labels faded, and near the center stood an old trunk. Beside it, half covered by a sheet, was a phonograph. The brass horn was dulled but handsome. A record lay on the turntable. The needle rested in the groove. The waltz stopped the moment I entered. I did not touch the machine. I only stared, feeling the uncomfortable sense of having stepped into someone else's room. Then I came down, latched the trap door, and tried to forget the matter. The next day, I asked the owner, Mr. Edison, about the phonograph. He blinked slowly. "Old thing," he said. "Must have been left behind. People forget what they don't use." "Does it work?" He shrugged, too casual. "If it does, I've never heard it." That night, I waited in the parlor with my coat still on, as if I might need to leave quickly. At 9, the waltz began again. I climbed the ladder at once. The record was turning, but something had changed. A second record lay beside the first, set out neatly, and on the trunk someone had placed a small paper card, the kind used for labeling boxes. "Please do not move it." I stood very still. The attic felt colder, not from drafts, but as if the air had been drawn tight. I reached in and lifted the needle carefully, stopping the record. The silence that followed was sharp, almost impolite. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the turntable began to rotate again. The needle, which I had set back in its cradle, shifted, very slightly, and lowered onto the record by itself. The waltz resumed. I backed away in slow disbelief and descended without taking my eyes from it. Downstairs, I sat rigid in my chair and listened until the tune ended. I expected relief. Instead came a soft click overhead, a pause, and the faint scratch of a needle finding a new groove. Another song began, slower, lonelier, a melody that trailed away just where it should have resolved. As the nights passed, it continued. Not the same record, never the same order. Waltzes, hymns, sentimental ballads. Always familiar enough to stir memory, always slightly wrong, as though each one had been worn by careful, repeated listening. By the 5th night, I decided to do what seemed most sensible. I carried the phonograph down from the attic. It was heavier than I expected. The brass horn was cold against my fingers. I moved slowly, speaking to no one, feeling foolish in my own house. I set it in the parlor, placed the records beside it, and sat back, satisfied with plain logic. If something wished to play it, let it do so where I could see. At 9 o'clock, the crank turned by itself, not quickly, not violently. It rotated with steady pressure, like a practiced hand. The record spun, the needle lowered. The first notes filled the room. I watched, heart thudding, as the machine performed its small, impossible act. Yet what unsettled me most was not the movement. It was the feeling that came with it. The quiet certainty that the phonograph had never belonged to the attic at all. The attic had belonged to it. As the tune played, the gaslight softened. Not a flicker, but a slow dimming, as if the room were drifting away from the present. The corners deepened. The wallpaper pattern seemed briefly sharper, like it had been newly pasted. Then I heard it, a gentle sound in the parlor itself. Footsteps, careful and light, crossing the floorboards as though trying not to disturb the furniture. There was no figure I could point to, no shadow shaped like a person, only the weight of someone moving where no one should have been. When the song ended, the crank stopped. Silence returned. Then, very close to my ear, there came a whisper, not a word, but a soft exhale carrying the faint scent of lavender and dust. I stood so quickly my chair toppled backward. The noise was loud in the quiet room. The phonograph started again immediately, needle dropping with a decisive click, like an answer. I did not sleep that night. I sat with the lamp on until dawn, and when daylight finally thinned the corners, I carried the machine back upstairs. I placed it exactly where I had found it and covered it with the sheet. Before climbing down, I looked again at the trunk. The labeling card had changed. Now it read, "Thank you. I moved out within the week." When Mr. Edison asked why, I told him I had found lodging closer to work. He nodded with that same thin smile and did not press for details. As I left, I glanced once at the attic window. Behind the clouded glass, I thought I saw a faint gleam of brass, just the edge of a horn catching light, or perhaps only the reflection of my own uneasy eyes. Even now, certain old melodies, waltzes, slow hymns, make my stomach tighten for no sensible reason. And sometimes, when night is very still and I wake too close to 9, I find myself listening, half expecting that gentle crackle to begin again, as if somewhere in the dark a needle is being lowered with practiced care, and a house is remembering the person it prefers to keep.